Kevin, thank you so much for being here today. Really excited for this one.
Likewise, man. Likewise.
So, one thing that kind of cracks me up when I was thinking about this episode was how you've made your money and what you've really created as your passion is gardening and creating content. And those are two very non-traditional ways to make money and to have a career. What do you think you'd be doing if you didn't do those things?
I think it depends on if I was down the traditional path or not. If I was down the traditional path and like didn't sort of have the realization that you didn't have to go that way, I would probably be an accountant right now because that's what I came out of school with, an accounting
Mm.
degree from UCSB. Um, and maybe would have realized it wasn't that fun. Maybe not. Would have maybe I would have been resigned to it. I have no idea. If this had not worked out, man, it's hard to say. I would imagine maybe like an ecom business or something in the realm of do not have to go into an office world, something like that. But it's really hard to predict.
That's interesting. Do you think you would have still been drawn to gardening eventually?
I
Like,
would hope so. Yeah,
yeah.
just based on what it has given me for sure. But who knows? It could have been carpentry or cooking or baking, some sort of like skill set that's ancient, I suppose. I
Mm.
would have always landed on something like that.
Do you think it's in the watching things grow?
I think
Like
it's in
develop?
the like it's like this it's a slower version of building like a universe, I suppose, compared to let's say,
Mm.
I don't know, like scaling up a software company or something. It's like this slow, shaping of the world, I guess, or your little pocket of it.
What's the most rewarding part of that?
To me, it's this like if we're talking straight up gardening, it is watching your plan come to life over the course of
Mm.
seasons. And so you'll plant some trees, some orchard, you'll finally get the fruit of that, or you have some idea. I have the citrus orchard that I planted them really close together, so like 4 feet apart, which you really normally you wouldn't do that. But my idea was, well, I'll hedge them all as if they're one large 20-foot long plant.
Mm.
And that was 2 years ago, and it's finally starting to actually look exactly like that. And so you're like, oh, okay, I was right. And this actually plays out the way I wanted it to.
It's funny because it seems like it's kind of the same thing with content as well. Like having this idea in your brain and then bringing it into reality. It's
Hmm.
almost the same thing
Yeah,
in
I
that
think
way.
so. Especially if you get into multiple platforms and how those platforms interplay with one another, and how you might introduce new talent or new characters or new concepts, and how you can see the sort of effect of that cascade into the platforms you're building in general.
Hmm. It's very interesting. And when I was scrolling through your content and I was seeing your house in San Diego, the thought popped into my head if you had no constraints, financial,
Mm.
physical, and you were to build the garden of your dreams, and this is like, where are you building it and why?
Yeah, where is interesting. I mean, I've looked at Michigan a good amount. Um,
Really? Michigan? That surprises me.
Yeah, look at Michigan. I mean, you have the freshwater source, right? And then you've got, I think it's like 20% of all the freshwater on Earth is in those lakes. Then you've got relatively protected climate from most major disasters like tornadoes and hurricanes, and like all that stuff doesn't really happen there. No earthquakes. The land's relatively affordable. So I'm maybe there. I'm not quite sure. It'd be nice to do it somewhere here, but that would be quite expensive. And then what would I build? I think it would go far beyond a garden. You'd have like silvopasture where you're running animals through open fields. I'd get into some sort of forestry. Get into building a lake. I once did a celebrity's garden, and we're out at her house, and she had built a 1/4 acre lake.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, I'm not quite at that level yet, but it'd be
That's pretty
interesting to
cool.
do.
Yeah.
So I think I'd just get into ecosystem design almost.
Hmm. It's such a fun world. It's a very interesting and cool world, and it seems like more and more people have this inkling to go back to that and to kind of live a life that's more aligned with nature.
Hmm.
Like I even saw a company recently that was doing like homestead real estate developments,
Mm.
and it just seems like more and more people have this desire to either live on a farm or live with a lot of animals. Have you thought about that at all? Like why that would be?
I mean, my thinking is that the stuff that has made us happy and fulfilled across, you know, many millennia is basically the same. And the stuff that we've added via society technology, it's supposed to enhance it, but at the point we're at, it seems to be also detracting from it at a equal or greater rate. And so I think you're getting this like return to natural lifestyles that people, they're sort of yearning for, like what has always made us happy, I guess. Um, that's the best theory I have, especially because we become more industrialized, more urban, that you're just completely removed from all of that. And people just want to be more like that all of the time, but not sacrifice all of the modern technology that we've
Hmm.
developed.
Yeah, it's a cool balance that you've developed with modern technology, but also returning back to nature in a way.
Hmm.
It's a very cool thing to see. So I was curious with that, like obviously people have a lot of those ideas and they think that they want that life, right? But the reality is probably much different than that when they actually do it. Is there some, from the other side of things, are there some unforeseen benefits that those people don't realize, like the um, in the enjoyment of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the result, because everyone's like trying to get the result, right? I want the eggs, or I want the, you know, the produce or the milk if you have a cow or something like that. It's like, sure, that's like the baseline result that you would get. It's like thinking about it as an input output type of system. But if you think about it as like the things that surround your life, right? And those are ever present. And so, you know, if I walk outside, I always have a garden there. I always have chickens there. It's the daily experience, I think, that's more rewarding. Of course, the table stakes that you're going to get the tomatoes, you're going to get the eggs. That's fine. And then you can share that with people as well. It's just it's a more rich tapestry to life than it
Mhm.
might otherwise be. To me, compared to someone who's like, I don't know, a pharmaceutical sales rep living in Miami in a high rise condo, you know, outsourcing every other aspect of their life besides income maxing that one job. Like, to me, that's not how I would prefer to live. And it seems like a lot of people are going, maybe I don't prefer to live that way either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just having those skills, right? Like, I mean, I've been freaked out with AI a bit recently, and all this whole world, and
Yeah.
um, it made me have the thought of just like I need to be able to fend for myself, like just and to have that self-sustaining ability is crucial,
Yeah.
especially like with kind of the direction things are heading in.
Yeah, my harsh take, I guess, is like I see these folks everywhere, you know, on Twitter or whatever, and they're like, you know, here's how I've outsourced everything. Like, I have a trainer, then I have a meal delivered, then I have a cleaner, then I have a this. And I employ some of those services as well, for sure. But if you have all that and you have no ability, no self-sufficient abilities, to me, I think it's sort of a weak approach to
Mhm.
life. I don't think it fosters like a deep sense of capability within oneself, you know?
So when it comes to the outsourcing, like in my mind, when I think about having this self-sustaining homestead and something that I'm trying to build later on, I would love for it to happen in a way that wouldn't require so much effort on my end
Hmm.
selfishly. Is that is that possible? Is it easy to accomplish? I know it depends on where you are, but is there a way where you can do it where your inputs are um, or your outputs are far greater than your inputs?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you'd have to not be like me. You'd have to just do it for the output, right? And in that sense, you might think about it more as like a farming system versus a gardening
Hmm.
system. So you could
Okay.
say, you know, I'm going to grow the highest calorie crops only that are the easiest. So like I'm going to do beans and peas or something like that. Or, you know, chickens are actually relatively
Yeah.
low input, especially if you get them when they're older. If you raise them from baby chicks, it's pretty high input at the start. But if you get them when they're older, they're called pullets, and you put them in the coop, there's really not a whole lot to do to care for them, and you'll get quite a bit of eggs every single day. So yeah, I think if you go in with that framing, for sure you could do it.
Is it a pretty cool synergistic effect between those animals and the plants?
Yeah, yeah. My hens have now learned to fly out of the coop. I built this little outdoor section of the coop that I thought was tall enough, and it's not. And so every morning I'll walk out, and they're out there running through the garden. And most of the time, there's enough insect population there that that's what they're eating. Sometimes they'll mess with the garden a little bit, but you're getting them cleaning up the insects. Of course, they're converting that protein into an egg for you.
Yeah.
But then their droppings, they'll either leave in the coop or in the hen house, and you can clean that out, compost that through, and cycle that back into the garden as fertilizer. And so that's why you get into these systems in like smaller farming operations like backyard farms or agriculture, where you'll have chickens on tractors moving from plot to plot, or larger animals will run through those systems as well.
Would you ultimately like to get into some regenerative agriculture, like a bigger farm where you have more things?
Yeah, I think so. I think it'd be very interesting to get into something like that. I don't know if it would be I'm farming for the living itself. I think it'd be interesting at Epic, for example, to do a larger plot and have it run more like a regenerative system.
Mm.
But in our case, that would, of course, be to teach and to make content about, maybe to show other people instead of running it like as a profitable operation itself. Maybe it would be still, but that wouldn't be the explicit goal.
When you get those people who reach out to you, and I'm sure you get a ton of DMs and all stuff like that of just people reaching out. Are there some common questions that are good questions that you see over and over again?
Yeah, I mean it's really just like, what can I grow in my area is a really common one. I think when you start out, you just have no idea what to plant, where, when, how, and so that's by and large that's the most common question. And then it would be the basics of like, what kind of soil to use, how much water should I be doing, where should I plant this thing, and then once they have it planted, it'll be, what pest is this, what disease is this, or what
Hmm.
what's happening to this plant that it doesn't look normal, so what's happening to it. As it's that realm of questions that ends up coming through.
Very interesting. Yeah. So there's not some like very generalized questions where you can give like a blanket answer. It's very
That's the tough
individualized
part.
based on, yeah.
Yeah, that's the tough part. It's like right now it's a great time for, let's say, me to start cabbage, right? And
Okay.
if because I'm in San Diego, I don't
Yeah.
have a winter. It doesn't freeze in my area. Maybe it gets to like 45 degrees or so, which cabbage can easily withstand. And so for me, counterintuitively, growing cabbage through the winter is the best time to grow it because it gets cold enough and it prevents the pests that destroy it. But if I told that to, someone who lives in Michigan, that would be terrible advice, right? And so everything's bespoke to the exact situation someone's living in. And when you're a beginner, it's really difficult because you don't want to hear that like very personalized advice. You just want to hear like, plant this, put it here, do this. But you have to give them a little like preamble before that they can actually
Hmm.
get going.
That's interesting. Yeah. So what do you think some of that advice would be for yourself when you were just getting started? Like if you were to have a conversation with you right before you started this gardening and the content, Epic Garden, all this type of stuff, what would that conversation look like? What would some of those pieces of wisdom that you would have given to your past self?
And as far as gardening goes, or content.
Kind of general, just either or.
Yeah, I mean, I would say with gardening, I would have told myself to grow what I like to eat more instead of what's easy. Because everyone will say, "Well, what's the easiest thing I can grow just to get
Mm,
started?" And if that doesn't also map to something that you enjoy eating, then it's kind of a waste because you're just like, radishes is a great example. Super easy to grow. A lot of people don't like them, especially freshly grown. Like they don't really know what to do with them. And so it's like, okay, cool. Well, what was the point of growing it then? It might have been easy, but that's not super enjoyable, the end product. For content, I think I would have said it's going to take longer than you think to get the flywheel going,
mm.
but and you should also probably hire help sooner than you did. Is what I would say there.
That whole world is it's something I'm starting to realize for myself with the content stuff. And I think the analogy holds true with gardening as well, is that once you start and you get a little momentum and you start almost like running downhill and you're almost in too deep and you're on
Hmm.
this roller coaster you can't really get off of. Does it feel like a trap sometimes, like with the garden and with all these responsibilities at home, with the content? Do you feel like you can't allow yourself the time to travel or to just unplug and turn off?
Yeah, for a while it was like that. I mean, to some degree it still is, but it's getting better now that we have a much larger team to support. But I would say, I used to go on this vacation with my cousin every January. We'd do like a week somewhere. So we'd go to like, Barcelona, Mexico City, all these different places. And then 2019 that stopped. I think that was the last year I did it because I started doing product. So I started offering
Mm.
product at Epic, and the YouTube channel was growing, and the podcast was growing, right? And from 2019 until 2022 summer, I don't think I went on a vacation in any reasonable sense. Like maybe a little weekend thing here or there, but nothing like more than 3 days. And so yeah, it's a real thing, especially with my craft, because if I
Yeah.
was a carpenter, right, like I could just close the shop up. It's not like things are happening while I'm gone. But in the sense of gardening, it definitely is. A garden could get totally out of control, or a video you were working on, that plant is going to die, right? And then where's the video? And so there's all sorts of stuff like that. Fortunately, now it's a little better spot, but it's still a real thing.
Yeah. Do you have any regrets from that? Because I find for myself right now, there's a trying to figure out, like, I love what I'm doing and I'm really enjoying the podcast and all this stuff, but is there a point that when you look back, you will regret being so all in? Have you found that?
I would say, in hindsight, given the level of success, no. But if I had not succeeded at this level, maybe I would have said yes, right? So the juice is worth the squeeze, given that I got to squeeze the juice.
Mm.
So
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
it gets a little bit recursive, I suppose. But no, I mean, I think it's all trade offs, and I still think it was probably the right trade off at that time. That building period was like my 32 to 35 ish, or 30 to 33 ish, I would say. Um, and I would say if I had regrets, it would be before that point. It wouldn't be
Mm.
it during that building phase, because that was very fun in its own way, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to Hawaii and surfing or whatever, but there's certain experiences that money can't buy,
Oh yeah.
and that would be the building phase of that. I would say I wasted more of my earlier 20s than I did my building phase of my 30s.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that you think you wasted some of your
Yeah, I
20s?
mean, I think I was just kind of like lost. I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't know how the world worked very well, and so I came out of school with a accounting degree. Knew I didn't want to do it because I was playing online poker to pay for school, and so that set me on this path of like, I don't want to be working at Deloitte making 60K a year, 80 hours a week. It's just bad trade. And so I was like, well, I'm just not going to get a job. Then I'll play some poker. Then I'll figure something else out. But I didn't like I did, the wheels were not spinning very fast back then, and so I thought I was way more elite than I was. Like, oh, if you get a job, like you're dumb, like you're someone else's slave, or like all these sort of things. It's just very odd belief system. Maybe I was consuming the wrong books, the wrong content at the time, and so I was too high on my own supply while also
Mm.
not being successful at all. And so it was like, it was like a total clown setup of
Mhm.
beliefs, right? And so that stalled me out because I didn't want help from anyone. I didn't want to ask for support. I could have worked a job where I would have maybe, let's say, mentored under someone really skilled and learned a lot faster. And I did not do that. Meanwhile, I was like toiling away trying to do these little business projects and failing, when if they were going to fail anyways, maybe I should have gone on some more trips in my early 20s or something, or maybe I should have done like a gap year and traveled around the world or something, because I would have had the same amount of money at the end, because I was losing money doing the business stuff. So it's hard to say, like, everything in retrospect, you could always like, you just can't play out the counterfactual. Like, if I didn't fail all those businesses, maybe this wouldn't have happened, right? So I can't necessarily be that mad at it, but you do look back and go, man, I was kind of dumb back then.
It brought a smile on my face when you said you paid for school through online poker, and it's something
Yeah.
I've heard you say in the past.
Hmm.
But how the hell did you get so good at poker that you were able to do that?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I wasn't that good. I was in a group. There's a forum called 2plus2.com, and I found that forum pretty early, I think, and that's where I met some of these players who were really skilled. And then it turned out the really skilled players were in an IRC chat called MSNL, Medium Stakes No Limit, and it was just the group of people who wanted to chat about poker, not just on a forum. So it was like a little IRC chat, and I got into that, and I was probably the worst person there for a while, and would watch all these players discussing their hands. We call it hand history, right? And so you'd post a hand history, and you'd say where you were, where the other player was, how they'd been playing, how you'd been playing, the stack sizes, all that kind of all the data, right? And then people would just analyze it. They'd say like, Now, in this situation, I would always go all in, or I would instantly call this person, or that's, 87% of the time that's a bluff or whatever. And you go like, wait, how do you know that? And so you'd ask them all these questions, right? And they'd break down the science and the sort of intuition of the game. And then you would try to notice those patterns when you were playing and apply the logic in those situations. Um, and then the added wrinkle is like, how well could you control your own emotions? Like, what was your level of emotional control? Because you could be highly, highly skilled, but if you have low emotional control, then you actually could be worse than someone who's worse than you, right? On a technical level. And this was actually the case with some of the really good players is when they were on, no one was better. No one could beat them, right? On a long enough time frame, no one could destroy them. But the second you did something that made them upset, you like beat them in an improbable way or whatever, they would just lose their minds and they'd start dumping like tens of thousands of dollars to you. And so there were players that were like that. There were players that, and I was more in this latter category, there were players that I had some problems with emotional control, but generally I was pretty good. But also, my skill bar, I was above average. I was never like very, very good. So if I was above average in skill and my emotional control was like maybe a B plus, then I could go to tables and grind it out basically. So I'd have a small edge, and you play a small edge over a long enough period of time, you're just going to grind out money. And that's kind of the position that I was in because I could never fully divorce myself from the value of the money that I was playing with, like some of these more skilled players. They would say, in the end, it's all just blinds. It's a if you're playing 200 400 with a $40,000 buy-in, that's still you still have 100 blinds worth of a stack, right? If you're playing a $200 buy-in with $1 $2 blinds, it's still 100 blinds worth of a stack you're playing with. And they were able to divorce that and say like, yeah, it's just a percentage of a stack. There's no monetary value to it. I could not do that when I was playing, and so if I lost, I would be mad. It's like, I just lost $1,000 in one hand, right? Whereas they would say, yeah, I lost a stack of blinds basically, and probabilistically was the right move. Like you go in with all aces pre-flop, you're going to lose 20% of the time, but you would always do it. And so why be mad that this time was the 20%? So I would that's my little spiel on poker. There's a lot you can learn from it though, as a craft, I would say.
It absolutely seems like there's a lot you can learn from it, just about life and emotional control, like you just said. It reminds me of this quote from Miyamoto Musashi, the samurai, which is when you know the way broadly, you see the way in all things. And like as you
Mm,
were talking about poker, it's like kind of reminded me of playing baseball and of building a business and of and just of
yeah.
pursuits in general that are meaningful and hard. It seems like there's a lot you can learn about life through that.
I think so. I mean, I think I don't even know if this is the right quote, and obviously he's had a bit of a glow down lately. But I think Kanye had a quote where he said like everything's the same to some interviewer. He was on some random interview, and they asked him something, maybe about music or fashion. I think they asked him about fashion. I think because he was doing his Yeezys right at the time, and they're like, "Well, what makes you think that you can get into this?" I don't know if I'm remembering this, but I think that's what it is. And he was just like, "Everything's the same." And the person clearly did not understand what he was saying. But what I think he was saying is like once you see the patterns of how things happen, it's replicable everywhere else. It has a different flavor, has a different formulation, but the sort of the building blocks of it are all tied together with no matter what you do.
Do you feel like you've seen that in your own life?
I've seen it in a few things at least. I mean, I've seen it in poker, business, and nature and gardening now, right? And so that's three sort of. I'd say poker and business relatively close together, but the garden is quite different. And I've
Yeah.
seen those patterns in the garden map to something I noticed that's similar, let's say in business, right? And so I go, huh, I guess things are the same in that way.
Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So like, when I first moved into my house here, it's a third of an acre or so. When I moved in, it was a flipped home, and so what they did is they just scraped off all the sod and put some very simple wood chips down, and there was really nothing else. There's no other plants or anything like that. And so the first year was really bad pests. Like I had earwigs, those little like weird little bugs, tons of them, like way, way more than I've ever seen in any other garden. Well, why? Because they're decomposers by nature. That's like sort of the role they play in the ecosystem. And they typically decompose recently dead material, like recently dead plants or something like that. Well, all the wood chips are a ton of that.
Mm.
And there was nothing else, right? And so there probably weren't that many earwigs until they did that. And then earwigs proliferated that little ecological system, right? And then when I started adding in garden beds, different, different like trees and shrubs and stuff like that, well, then what happened? Well, birds came in. There was less material for the earwigs to eat. There were more species of insects as well, some that predate on the earwigs, and you start to see the population come back into order. And you could map that very much to, let's say, a business that finds a competitive advantage in a certain way. Like, let's say Uber in the early days against taxis, right? They found this sort of hack in the system where they're like, well, we're just not going to use the medallion system. We're going to use an app, and we're sort of going to float these regulations and loosely interpret them or disregard them. You might map that sort of thinking to, hey, there's a entire field of wood chips I can just eat right now, and I will massively increase my population size. That's basically Uber saying that same thing to themselves, but I'm going to gain market share, right? So it's a very similar thing. So like untapped resource, or maybe a resource that always existed but no one had seen it before, they scale to the moon through that, but then eventually they get big enough that they actually sort of cut themselves down to size on it, not because they wanted to, because it had to happen, right? You get big enough, and then a pest, so to speak, local government goes, hey, actually, you actually really need to follow these regulations, so I'm going to cut you down in, I don't know, Utah or something like that. Like Utah's like, yo, no, you're not going to do this. It's something like, it's very similar, right? Like the expansion and contraction of like a market or a company within a market, you might say is similar to like a pest exploiting a particular ecosystem until it can't anymore because it's gotten too big or something else has come in to stop it. So that's just one example. But that's the type of connections that I've started to see just from doing this type of thing.
Puts a smile on my face because it isn't the analogy or the example, I should say, that I thought you would say.
Yeah.
Because, but it is like the perfect analogy. Like they saw opportunity and they took the opportunity, and then they got too big for their own good.
Hmm.
But how, when you think about that, I mean, that's almost a universal story, right? People getting
Hmm.
too big for their own good, and now you're doing something that's getting pretty big with the
Yeah,
content, with the
I know.
social media, with YouTube. Do you how do you think about those two things?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, where does it end, right? Because growth can't, you can't grow forever. Otherwise every business would outscale, the earth itself. And so things do have to hit a natural limiter, which you might say is your TAM, right? Your total addressable market or something like that. Or you might stumble along the way, and the cracks in the system start to appear. So I'm always thinking, okay, what would that be for us? Like, how could that happen to us? Or how might we, um, engineer our way out of that situation? Or at some point you got to say, like, well, should we, like, is there such a thing as a company that needs to grow forever? My opinion is no. Like, I don't think so. um, I think some businesses, there's that whole idea, I think, in German culture of like the Mittelstadt or something like that, where the business's goal is to keep being a business. That's about
Hmm.
it, right? And so like they put aside a certain amount of money for R&D, taking profit out of the system. So making sure they're keeping up with the times, but they're not, they're not plowing 100% back in and taking outside capital to grow. They're just sort of going along with through the sands of time, which is, it's just a totally different philosophy, right? Or like the Japanese businesses that have been handed down by 10 generations. It's not like they're trying to scale to the moon like a lot of the people in America are.
So the goal in this German phrase is to just stay in business. So essentially win through
Yeah.
endurance.
I don't even think they think. I mean, look, I'm not some pro here of understanding, but I'm going to look it up right now. I think it's just to keep being a business doing the thing that they're doing.
Mm.
Like if you're a tailor or something, you're a tailor. Like
Yeah.
people will always need clothes to be tailored, and you just do that and pass it through the sands of time to the next, whoever wants to run it next. And the fact that it still exists is the win. It's not
Mm.
that, it exists and other things don't exist or something like that, right?
It's interesting because we hear so much nowadays, especially on social media, when people give business advice, and it's like, think bigger, think
Hmm.
bigger, scale to the moon, 10x everything in your business, make it as big as possible. I wonder if the mindset of just staying alive allows you to have more success than that 10xing type of mindset.
And I think it's two different games, you know. And I think if you raise any sort of money, you just de facto opted into the former game. Like
Mm,
you have to grow. There's no choice because why? Because the people who gave you the money want you to grow, and they exert some level of control, right? But yeah, I just found it, the middle stand, I think.
Bestand.
But anyways, it says family ownership, family like corporate culture, generational continuity, long-term focus, independence, nimbleness, emotional attachment. Interesting. Investment into the workforce, lean hierarchies, social responsibility, and regional ties, which is so opposite to what you would do if you
In
were
poker.
doing that 10x play, right?
And if you were playing poker,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
emotional
exactly.
attachment,
Hmm.
it's very different.
It's saying this is what I want to do, and I don't want to exit it. There isn't an exit. My exit is death, right?
Yeah.
On this business, which is a cool. It's a cool philosophy. It's a cool way to operate. It's like a sort of a hardcore way of doing it. Um, it reminds me of that like that classic like fisherman parable, right? The fisherman and the businessman, where the guy's like, well, you could scale this out and you could do this, you could do that, and he's like, well, for what? And he's like, well, then you could sit on the beach and fish. And he's like, what do you think I'm doing, right? It's
Mhm.
it's sort of the realization that that's what would happen to you anyways, and just saying, okay, I'll just stay this way then, which is it's you got to respect it.
That's an interesting analogy for what you do, right? Because on one hand, you're a gardener,
Hmm.
but on the other hand, you're this businessman who scaled it and is growing it. So you ultimately could go and be the gardener again. Do you do
Yeah,
you think about it
yeah,
that way?
I do actually. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? I think it's interesting. I like interesting things. I like things that interest me, and so figuring out how to grow something, it's just inherently interesting to do, and so that part's fun and enjoyable. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a pain and very stressful. But in some way, that also is fun, right? It's not like fun is only things that give you a dopamine hit or something. At least to me.
Mm.
Uh, so in some way, that's the challenge is a deeper level of fun, and then you get into this whole idea of like, well, why are you doing it? You would probably just be a gardener at the end of the day, build a nice home and chill. And it's like, yeah, I probably would, but for me, there would always be something else I would be trying to do,
Mhm.
just because it's interesting. And so to me, so far, right now in this moment of life, it feels like the right hybrid thing to be doing.
Yeah, it reminds me of this quote from Jordan Peterson, which is like, humans are made to walk uphill. I don't know the exact quote, but
Mm.
essentially along the lines was like, the fun is in the climb, and
Hmm.
it's not in the win itself. And I wonder, do you think about with the content stuff, especially that it's grown so much and it's been such a success? Do you feel like you've already won that game, or do you feel like there's more mountains to climb?
I would say I've won. Anyone might say that I've won it, right? It reminds me of the PewDiePie sort of discussion of who did YouTube the best, and a lot of people, I think at least, and some friends of mine as well, think it was PewDiePie because he played it in a pure way. He didn't like try to, he didn't go the Mr. Beast route, which there's nothing wrong with. He went his own way, um, put out what he wanted, grew the way he wanted, had fun with it, dealt with the stresses that came with it. And then when he realized, which for him was hitting 100 million subscribers, which is pretty big,
Crazy.
but when he was like, look, there's nothing else here. There's the 110th million sub. It doesn't matter. Like there is no end to that. And I've already gone well beyond what I would imagine I had. I've made more money than I would imagine I've had. And so I'm just going to move to Japan with my new wife and vlog about Japan whenever I want, and that's just what it's going to be. So he said goodbye to everyone on the channel, but he wasn't leaving, but he was in a certain way, and he sort of signified that by he will sometimes do videos where he says, featuring PewDiePie in the video that he'll release. signifying that I think to him he feels like he's Felix now. He's not PewDiePie. PewDiePie's dead, but he could recall him from the grave and feed that persona in a video in a sort of tasting of the past way. But he's not that guy anymore.
Mm.
And so in a sense, I would say he has retired, and in another sense, you might say he's just begun his next iteration.
Reminds me of the stuff I've heard you say in the past that you've learned from like Eckhart Tolle and that whole world of philosophy that there's almost no you. It's just
Yeah,
continually changing.
yeah. I mean, I want to say that's when realized that was when I read The Power of Now. It was like 2010 or 11 or something like that. Or you know what? It was that, and then there was this really weird DVD I found a long time ago. There was this company called Real Social Dynamics that made like social skills training, and I think it was loosely affiliated with like the pickup artist stuff or something. And at the time, I there was this DVD called like The Blueprint Decoded, and it wasn't about picking up women or anything like that. It was about like your own identity and um, how the identity you think is your identity is not. It was given to you by your mom and your dad and your friends and your teacher and all the different sort of actors in society, right? And it was basically saying like, well, all that was given to you, so you can also shed it if you so choose. You could say, well, you could question all of it and say like, okay, well, do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? Well, no. Why? Why do I have to? Well, my teacher told me I have to go to college. Well, why did they tell you ask the whys all the way down, you realize it's all nonsensical to some degree, which could be very terrifying, right? Or it could be very freeing, probably a combination of both. And that's when I realized that there isn't really a coherent identity that's persistent over time. Um, so yeah, it was sometime around there. It's still a very weird thing to think about, right? Because you think that you're one person, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
Why do you think that was so impactful for you at that
I think
time?
it's because I really thought I was a person. Like I was like I really thought that there was a Kevin that would exist from birth to death, right?
Mm.
Um, that's why, because it broke that forever for me. I was like, oh shit, like that's not that's not how it works. Because I remember I watched that DVD and then I slept for like 12 hours a day for 3 days, just because I was so tired. But I didn't know why I was tired because I didn't like work out or anything, right? And so I think my brain was like, whoa, like this, the whole world's different now. I don't know. It was a very weird experience.
It's a very interesting experience. I almost don't know what to make of it, right? Like that
Mhm.
sleeping 12 hours after you hearing that information, feeling
I
like your
don't either,
body's just
and
like processing it.
I'm like not the kind of guy to be like, oh, like the mystic spoke to me or
Yeah.
anything. It's nothing like that. It's just a very weird experience. I
Yeah.
don't have an explanation for it.
It's funny. How do you think you as Kevin have changed from gardening? What do you think it fundamentally has changed about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it connected me back to the actual systems of the world, the actual Earth itself. So I realized how difficult, let's say, it is to grow food or to produce food without it having pests, or to transport that food or to process it into the things that I might like to eat or grew up liking to eat, like a potato chip or something like that. Um, but it connects to everything, right? So you see the garden, you say, well, if I plant these sorts of things here, I put this pond here, I put these trees here. Well, I see the birds come back in this way. I see the mammals come back in this way. And I see this and I see that. And I go, well, we've been doing the opposite for the last however many hundred years. We've been removing all of the environment and then sort of lamenting the decline of certain species or this or that. And you go, well, yeah, well, but you're the one doing it. So what are you complaining about? You can't throw a tweet up about, we need to save the pygmy marmoset or whatever, and then consume the products that are being deforested. They're deforesting the rainforest where that particular mammal lives at the same time, like immediately after you send the tweet. It's like it is all paradoxical, right? And so it opened me up to sort of that aspect of modern living.
When did you first start your garden?
I think the first one I ever had would have been 2013. So
2013.
10 years ago, yeah, it was just an indoor like hydroponic garden at the time in a little townhouse. But yeah, it was about 10 years ago.
It seems so crazy that just 10 years ago you were first getting started and now you are the guy for gardening.
I know. Yeah, well, I think isn't that interesting, right? Like
Right?
because there's people that are older than me for sure, and definitely have more. Um, you know what? Honestly, these days I think I have a lot of gardening experience, especially across different domains. But there are still people. There's always going to be in the world of gardening and tree care and roses and these sort of things. The older you are, the better you are. You've seen more seasons, right? And so there's always going to be someone better than me at trees, at roses, at a tomato. I know the guy who named some of the most popular heirloom tomato varieties. He's grown 6,000 maybe at this point, different types of tomatoes. Like I'll never get there, right? But I think maybe that's perhaps why it worked out so well because I came in with something fresh,
Mm.
something a little different. I was not the expert, so preaching down from the top. I was like, hey, like this seems cool. Like I'm gonna figure this out, and I'll share what happens along the way.
So really it was you documenting your journey. That was the
hmm
thing.
Well, I think at the start, it was a great thing to have realized at the start. I think is that I am going to just not say I'm an expert, right? I'm just going to be like, hey, look, like this is what I'm doing. Here's what I've learned, and this is what's worked for me. It makes you way more relatable. It wasn't like some masterful plan or anything like that. It's just like I didn't have the credibility to lean on, right? And so I was like, well, I can lean on the opposite of credibility then, that I don't know exactly what I'm doing.
It's a great piece of advice for people who are trying to get started in that world because there is just such a sense of like imposter syndrome.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. I think the solution to that is so easy, and no one wants to do it. It's just being like, yeah, I don't know exactly what I'm doing. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying that. Um, and it weirdly will make people will relate to you better.
It almost just reminds me of like it's a paradox I learned when I was in college of the more authentic you are means the weirder you're going to be or the more different you're going to be. But
Yeah,
paradoxically, that makes people like you more.
yeah, yeah. So when you learned that in college, like what was the experience that made you learn that?
I was trying to like I was starting to get into like self-improvement stuff and I was
Yeah,
like, all right, I don't want to go out anymore. I want to be the guy who's eating healthy and not drinking beer and going to bed at 10 p.m. and all these type of things. And I was like
yeah.
so scared to embrace being that person or to just own the person I wanted to be. And then
hmm
when I started to do it, you realize that like, oh, people love when you're just authentic.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly. It's like the biggest. It's cool that you had the realization in college. I did not. I had it after college. I wish I had it in college because then college would have probably gone better. I would have had more true enjoyment out of it. But yeah, that is the paradox, right? It's like if you, there's no point in being anything but yourself because no one actually cares about you, right? In that, like, that's not accurate, but you get my point. Like no one's waking up every day going like, man, I wonder what Ryan's having for breakfast today. It's probably healthy, that healthy dude, you know what I mean? Like no one's thinking that. And the second you tell someone like, I don't drink, for example, like I currently barely ever drink. Not that I'm not like sober. I wouldn't say I'm like sober or anything, but I just barely ever drink. And I learned that in maybe 23, 24, 25. I did this thing with UCSF where I was like going out to bars and giving surveys, and it was about people's smoking habits. And so you get paid $5 to do a survey, to like administer the survey, and they would get $5 for like a drink or something like that. So I go out to these bars, but you could not be smoking or drinking when you were doing the survey because you were like the professional or whatever. So you're 23, 24, 25 doing these surveys, and I'd go out and I'd give them out, and I would have to talk to people, talk to strangers, right? And learn that not only is it pretty fine to talk to strangers, especially if you're giving them something like $5, they're okay with it. But they'd be like, "Are you drinking tonight? Like, I'll buy you the beer with my $5." I'm like, "Oh no!" Like, for a while, I said like I can't drink because of the survey because I wanted a convenient excuse that
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't my choice, it was their choice. I was being
Yeah.
forced to not. And then I was like, why am I saying that? Like, I don't even really drink that much anyways. Like, why am I trying to pretend like I'm the one who wishes I could, right? And so then I said, oh yeah, I don't really feel like it. It's not really, uh, you know, just kind of brushed it off. And then your whole point is true. Like they would be like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like you can just be in a bar without, drinking. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for a while now. No one really seems to care. I'll just get like soda water with some lime, and everyone thinks you have a Jack or a tequila lime anyway, so it doesn't matter, right? So yeah, it's the most counterintuitive thing, and I think a lot of people just like literally like die and don't ever realize that. They might get to 80 and they just like never realize that's how things work.
Do you think that that experience of learning that authenticity was one of the things that allowed you to start creating content?
I think, yeah, I would say I did not have any qualms about like publishing content in the early days. Well, that might not be perfectly true. I did put stuff up, but my face wasn't on the content at the start. And when I got to 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, back then at least, they would give you a YouTube partner manager from YouTube
Oh
to
wow.
try to help you grow. So like that bar is way higher now. So I'm really lucky I got into that at that time. But my partner manager, Hadass, she said, well, you should do collabs and you should put your face on, like you should be in the video. And I was like, why? Like, what will that do? What difference will that make? And she was like, I can't even believe I have to explain, that like being in your own video about gardening might help you, or collaborating with someone else. I was like, well, it's my channel. Like, why would I collab? I was so ignorant. I had no idea. So I think part of it was just like I was too ignorant to even know that there was something to worry about publishing content. I was like, well, I'll just do it.
That's so interesting, right? It's a funny world, that whole thing. And I want to be courteous of your time here and just ask you, like, is there anything you specifically want to talk about today that we haven't discussed? I know we wanted to try to make this episode a bit different than some of your other
hmm
episodes, and hope we accomplished that. But is there
I think we
anything
got a
on your
little
mind?
more like philosophical than prior ones, right? I don't know. I mean, um, I think this was great. It was fun. It was fresh. It was a little different, and it was cool to chat with you. I think we could go deeper about that experience you had in college too. Like that's an interesting topic that you could pull the thread on. I would really be curious, like when people realize that
Mm,
exact thing. Like you realized it earlier than I did, right? But I realized it maybe 24, 25. I have people that I know in my life right now that they still don't get that. They still are not aware that of the freeing thought that you can actually just be yourself. But I think the counterintuitive part to me is that's the advice, right? Like, okay, well, just be more yourself. But
mm.
how do you know what that is? It's almost easier to know what isn't yourself and just remove the things that aren't you, right? So if for you in that case, you're like, I want to eat healthy. Well, you're like, yeah, I mean, I'm
Don't
not
want to eat like
someone,
shit. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not someone who wants to eat unhealthily. The default state of what you become is just what's left. And so remove the things that you're not, and only thing that's left is who the essence of Ryan is or the essence of Kevin is, right? Like that's what I think is the more interesting way to get to that point.
I think that's such a great perspective because so many people, like, they just don't understand what they want out of life, right?
Yeah.
And just understanding what you don't want
It's
is
easier,
is
right?
so much easier. It's a lot
Yeah.
more powerful.
Yeah, like I don't want to live in a condo 30 stories above the ground
Yes.
ever again. And so default, I will be on the ground wherever I'm living, right? Like it's this tiny little point, but you start stacking all of those, and that's how you become it's how you become like categorizable, right?
Mm.
Like, oh, hey, this guy. Take myself as an example. You're like, well, this guy's like making his own sourdough bread and fermenting foods and doing this and that, and then he's also, making TikTok content, or I don't know, like he loves rock climbing or something. It's just all these random things put together because that's all that's left once you remove the things that aren't, and you're not following a thing. You're opposite. You're doing the opposite of that, right? You're rejecting things, and so you don't end up looking like a facsimile of the 17 most popular people in health and spirituality or whatever that exist on the earth, right? Huberman husband or whatever they call these people, right?
You've been watching
So
too much TikTok.
yeah, I don't know. The Huberman husband thing made it everywhere, right? Because it was so polarizing, right? Everyone's like,
Yeah.
this husband is a complete loser. How could this wife be with him? And the other people were like, oh wow, like this guy's so committed to his family or whatever. So it's so interesting.
It is so interesting. It's a funny
Yeah.
spectrum, that whole world of optimization and
Yeah,
that whole
I
thing.
know.
But
I know.
Kevin, thank you so much for being here today. This was awesome. You pushed me out
Yeah.
of my comfort zone a bit, and really enjoyed having this conversation.
Yeah, dude, it was great chatting. Thanks for having me, man.
Yes, absolutely.
Sweet, dude.
Beautiful.
That was fun.